am Frances Callier.
And I'm Angela V. Shelton.
And we're Frangela.
You know what you need in your life? The Final Word podcast.
Yes, you do.
That's right. It is the final word on all things political and pop cultural.
Where we make real news real funny.
Where we inspire you so you can #resist.
Subscribe and get a new episode of the Final Word podcast each week. It's the news we think you need to hear.
That's right. We think you need to hear it. Okay?
Yeah, it's what we say so.
That's right. And because all we do is give, every Thursday you can listen to our hysterical podcast, Idiot of the Week.
We round up the stupid because you know what? Somebody has to.
Okay. All we do is give.
Our press secretary gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to Unspun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hello, truth seekers, and welcome to this week's episode of Unspun. The BBC describes her as a slim young woman with dark hair and gray-green eyes. But sitting alone in a Normandy farmhouse in 1944, 23-year-old Phyllis Latour Doyle was more than just another English girl who liked to knit. Because the needles in her hands weren't just making scarves, they were helping to keep soldiers alive. She had parachuted into occupied France as part of Britain's Special Operations Executive, and her job seemed simple, right? She was going to ride a bicycle between villages, smile at Germans, look harmless. Between those stops, though, she turned back to her knitting kit where there was a silk thread waiting, ready for code. Every knot she tied marked a dot or a dash in Morse, and when the thread was full, she wound it back into her yarn. Sometimes she would wrap the coded silk around a knitting needle and tie it up into her hair with a shoelace. One time, a German officer told her to take her hair down, and she shook it loose and smiled at him, and he saw nothing. And her messages reached London. And that's trust as architecture, a single strand holding the weight of a whole network. And she was not the only needlework operative in history. In another room, Madame Lavengel sat by a window in occupied Belgium, knitting quietly while a German marshal was lodging in her home. She was tapping her heels on the floorboards, and she was sending coded signals to her children in the room below. The kids were pretending to do their schoolwork, and they wrote down each tap as a letter. And no one upstairs suspected that the click of needles and the shuffle of feet were transmitting troop movements for the resistance. Across Europe, the Alice Network, a network of ordinary people who happened to be chemists and radio operators and photographers, they built their own geometry of trust. Their brilliance wasn't in gadgets that they made, but it was in everyday things. Market stalls and knitting baskets, coded recipes, casual gossip that really wasn't casual at all. They used what the world already trusted, women's domestic work, and they turned it into cover. And if we step back another century, the pattern's still there. During the American Revolution, Molly, Old Mom Rinker, sat on a Pennsylvania hilltop overlooking British encampments. She pretended she was knitting while she watched the enemy, and she scribbled their movements on little scraps of paper. She tucked them inside balls of yarn, and she accidentally dropped them over a cliff to a Continental soldier waiting below. She never raised a weapon, just a ball of wool and her steady hand. And it was 3 women, but one kind of basic principle. The ordinary was shelter. Knitting worked because no one was afraid of it. You know, during nearly every conflict, women were urged to knit for soldiers, socks and hats and things like that. So knitting became a camouflage. To outsiders, it looked like care work, but to insiders, it was information. Every knot or purl said, "I'm with you." And that's where I want to start today. Not with codes or gadgets, but with trust as we look at resistance communication. Sound good? Let's get unspun. When we talk about the resistance, we usually picture the loud parts, right? Like the 2 No Kings protests. There were people marching and shouting and showing off their inflatable unicorn costumes. But the real architecture starts somewhere quieter. It starts in these small decisions that let people believe in another person when belief is risky. A scarf passed from one hand to another, or a poem that's read over shortwave radio that only some of the listeners really understand, or a text that disappears 5 seconds after it's read. Different centuries, but the same structure, kind of hidden rooms built out of trust. And that's the blueprint we're going to trace in this episode, how ordinary gestures become the beams and arches that hold the whole movement upright. How these secret spaces, kitchens and airwaves and encrypted chats, they stay standing even when the world is trying to shake them apart, because every resistance movement leaves behind its architecture if you know where to look. It's not drawn in blue ink on paper, but it's drawn in people, and how they choose to connect with each other when just the act of connecting can be dangerous. So we're going to walk through these blueprints together, from the foundation to the walls of sound and to the new digital rooms that we build today. And as we move forward, we'll look at another material that kind of shapes this architecture, which is the media itself. Because when voices are censored and when truth is kind of rationed out, every broadcast or pamphlet or encrypted post becomes a structural beam in that same geometry. And it's the geometry of resistance. In authoritarian times, keeping the line between information and propaganda is another act of trust. If every movement builds an architecture of trust, the foundation is made from things that people never think to notice, right? The pocket items, the laundry, the paper in your hands, because resistance has learned to hide inside the ordinary. Here's an example. In 1940s Norway, German soldiers filled the streets and propaganda filled the air. And within weeks, another language showed up, a paperclip stuck on your coat. And to the occupiers, it didn't mean anything. But to the Norwegians, it meant everything, because it meant, I'm still with you. It kind of started like a whisper in offices and cafes. It was a symbol that looked like you were complying, but it carried defiance. A paperclip was a loop of wire that could be worn openly. Strangers could trade them, and people recognized a message without words. And that's the first principle of any hidden structure. Use what the world already trusts. You can go back another century, and there's a different code hanging in the sunlight. During the American Revolution, a farmer's wife on Long Island hung a black petticoat on her clothesline. To her neighbors, it looked like another washing day, but to the Culpeper spy ring, it meant a new message was waiting. The number of handkerchiefs behind it revealed where the message had been hidden, in a hollow fence post or a false bottom barrel, a nearby tree that was marked with chalk. So to the oppressors, it looked like regular domestic life, but to those who knew, it was a living map. It wasn't the only place resistance held its message inside materials. There were hollow coins, bullets, even tiny silver balls carrying letters and coded instruction, because the safest place for truth was the most ordinary one. You couldn't outlaw things from everyday life, and that was the point. The power of those messages wasn't in clever design, it was in shared belief. Everyone who shared a message, who folded a note, or who held a decoy object understood the same unspoken rule. I'm keeping your secret and you're keeping mine. And this was trust that layered itself into daily life, because when those walls began to close in, when censors controlled newspapers and radios belonged to the state, that same instinct appeared in print. Across occupied Europe, citizens built illegal presses in attics and barns and basements. In the Netherlands, volunteers typed all night. They wrapped their machines in blankets to muffle the sound. Couriers smuggled these hand-typed newspapers out under loaves of bread or folded them inside stacks of laundry. One printer described the rhythm as publishing between heartbeats. And these pages didn't just spread information, they helped to keep shared reality intact. Because in a world that's built on lies, seeing a banned headline in your hands was proof that the truth still had meaning. So, if you think about it, there's a pattern that's kind of showing up, right? You have a paperclip, you have a single point of recognition. You have a laundry line, it's connecting 2 points. You have a hollow object, it's something that moves between walls as people carry it. You have an underground press, the wall itself, solid and visible. Together, they form the foundation of resistance. It's trust that's hiding in plain sight. Authoritarian systems rely on visibility, on seeing everything and knowing everything. That's why they encourage protesters to leave their phones at home. But the foundation of resistance thrives on opacity. It builds these private rooms inside public life. And once you have these rooms, once you have this network strong enough to share information, you can start to speak again. And that's the next layer of the infrastructure, the walls of sound, because there can be broadcasts and coded songs and whispered poems that turn the air itself into a shelter for truth. And this story starts long before we even had radio towers or encrypted apps. In the centuries of slavery, under total surveillance, communication itself was a rebellion. Enslaved Africans, torn from their languages, from their families, from their homelands, they found ways to talk to each other across distance and danger. They built the Borderland Network, a shadow system that carried information hundreds of miles in days, using what they had: light, fabric, and sound. One couple, only known as Ben and his wife, used a garment hung in a certain spot to show it was safe to meet. When darkness fell, they would flash lantern light through the cracks in their cabin walls. Once or twice, every few minutes, there were signals that I'm here, that I've survived. The quiet lights were architecture. They were beams made of rhythm. Coachmen and draymen and boatmen, they spread that information further. They carried news of escape routes, rewards, and patrols, plantation to plantation. The structure was loose and flexible and fast. It was said that news could travel several hundred miles in 2 weeks, and that's infrastructure. And then came Harriet Tubman, Moses to those who followed her north. Her network, the Underground Railroad, was itself an architecture of trust. It has had its own vocabulary, tracks and stations and conductors and passengers and cargo, and it was a language that made movement sound like machinery. It was hiding the meaning in plain sight. And when the words became too dangerous, Tubman turned to sound. She used songs as code, spirituals whose verses carried secret instructions. Go down Moses could mean to prepare. A change in tempo might mean to wait or to come on out. And she's known for leading people through swamps and forests, but she was also constructing communication, walls of sound that kept her people safe inside their meaning. Enslaved people were often not allowed to read or write, and written codes could be lethal. So they invented new whole languages, creoles, dialects born from the need to collect across forced diversity. And what overseers heard as strange tongues were actually languages of belonging. And this happened in other places. Across the Americas, the same creative geometry has emerged. So in Brazil, outlawed martial arts were disguised as dance, capoeira, fluid movement that was masked as celebration. In Jamaica and Haiti, planned uprisings used drummings and ceremony to sync communities that weren't allowed to meet. Even under the eyes of empire, they built these invisible rooms that were made of sound and timing that they shared. And centuries later, that wall of sound became more literal. In World War II, Radio Londres broadcast to occupied France. The voices of BBC announcers read poems. Please pardon the fact that I do not speak French well. Les sanglots longs de violon de la tombe. They were anything but random. To the French resistance, these were coded calls to act. The first line of this poem meant that sabotage was near, and the second line meant that D-Day had begun. And a generation later, radio again became a wall of protection and connection, but this time for Black Americans in the fight for civil rights. Churches remained gathering spaces, but the radio carried news further and faster, and often in disguise. DJs would report traffic jams to warn of police roadblocks. Music shows slipped coded instructions between records. Broadcasts told listeners which streets were safe, where marches were forming, where to find water and refuge. Because for people who had been denied literacy, radio was the only free medium left. You could hear even when you couldn't read. And behind the playlists, those DJs, those men and women, they became civic engineers. They were building walls that connected a scattered public into something whole. And by the 1960s, even the phone lines became part of this geometry. When white-owned telephone exchanges in the South worked hand in hand with police and civil rights groups, were able to create their own system. The wide area telephone services, or WATS lines. These were prepaid 1-800 numbers used by different groups to pass urgent updates. Bases had code names, operators used verbal ciphers, and it was fast and direct and private. One line could reach across states in seconds. So it was that same trust that had passed handkerchiefs and paper clips, and it was now running through copper wires. And today, that same architecture stands, only now it's digital. I need to take a quick break, but when I come back, we'll look more at digital tools as a mechanism for resistance movements. I'll be right back. Welcome back. I was in a city in the northern U.S. this summer, and I was surprised to see an icy road warning in August on my GPS. Eventually, I put together that this was a sign that there was an immigration enforcement raid or an ICE raid at that location. Now, that's out in the open, but encryption tools are also part of resistance communication. And like the DJs of the past, today's organizers are using visibility itself as a weapon. During Black Lives Matter protests, live streams and phone videos turned every bystander into a witness. Hashtags became rallying cries, and even as the state developed facial recognition and network mapping, communities used transparency to build counter-surveillance, public eyes watching the watchers. The Electronic Frontier Foundation's Atlas of Surveillance maps police technology across the U.S., flipping the script on data power, because every entry is a brick in a new wall of accountability. So from Harriet Tubman's songs to smartphone live streams, the message is the same. When the air is no longer free, you can fill it with the truth anyway. Because walls of sound do more than create information, they create belonging. If it's the rhythm of a drum circle or the hum of a transmitter, the static in front of a forbidden broadcast, they all tell you that you're not alone. In every age, sound has carried the message for a resistance that we are still here. And now, with digital air replacing the analog, we face a familiar challenge: how to keep those walls standing in the face of surveillance that's growing heavier and smarter. We've been here before. The frequency just changes. In the 20th century, a spy might have guarded a one-time pad printed on silk, but today that pad lives in code. You can think of it as encryption is the new Go Down Moses, or Signal and Tor is the new Capoeira. Every app or secure channel is a wall that's built to hold a meaning against surveillance. End-to-end encryption does the same work that Phyllis Latour Doyle once did with her silk thread. It helps keep meaning safe while it travels. So when you send a message through Signal or you route your traffic through Tor, you're using a digital descendant of those old couriers or those hollow coins, because each message is locked with a key that only the sender and the receiver can hold. The courier or the network, they can't read it. And we've seen that when states cut the wires, communities can rebuild the rooms out of air. In Iran, when blackouts lasted weeks, tech-savvy volunteers found other routes: satellite relays, VPN, a service that hides digital news files in satellite TV signals so that users can download truth through their dishes. But we have to remember that technology can seal a message, but it takes people to seal the trust. Modern resistance movements have learned the hard way that operational security, or OPSEC, is less about apps than it is about habits, right? So perhaps using a passcode on your phone instead of a fingerprint, because that lets you avoid searches at borders, or blurring people's faces in a photo that you take at a protest, a group chat that deletes itself. Each of these is a brick in the wall, and some people call it digital discipline, because it's asking you not to protect just yourself, but to protect everyone connected to you, because one mistake, an unlocked phone or a careless forward, can expose an entire network. So communities teach each other. As always, there's another side that's building its own geometry, and that's state surveillance. So governments are now employing deep packet inspection, the modern equivalent of opening every envelope in transit. China's Great Firewall scans for VPN protocols. Iran whitelists only state-approved channels and drops every other packet into silence. Authoritarian systems rely on the same assumption as empires before them, right? That visibility, knowing what's going on, equals control. But it cuts both ways, because now we have reverse surveillance. Activists and journalists can now flip the lens outward. Databases can track when police departments use drones or facial recognition or social media monitoring. And every data point like that, transparency becomes defense. During the Black Lives Matter protests and in today's ICE protests, live streams and cell phone footage turn the crowd itself into a sensor grid. Each upload is a reinforcement in a public architecture of witness. You can step inside any of these digital spaces, encrypted chats, private servers, password-protected archives, and you're going to feel it. There's that same tension between openness and secrecy that's always defined resistance. Rooms like these have boundaries. They require passwords or consent or intent. And inside them, people share their strategies and they share the truth of their survival. But outside, surveillance is hammering on the walls. But these rooms keep going because it's something that's older than code. It's people who choose trust over fear. And next, we'll look at what happens when these walls crack, the fragility of trust and how communities rebuild, because every structure faces stress. But what defines resistance isn't that the walls never break, it's that people rebuild them. In the 2019 Hong Kong protests, rooms became visible as light bouncing between phones. The marches had begun against a proposed extradition bill, one that would have allowed citizens to be sent to mainland China for trial. And when that bill was suspended, the crowds didn't leave because the movement had evolved into something bigger, a demand for democracy or not being absorbed by Beijing. But everyone knew that control could come at any moment because texts were monitored, emails were being traced. WeChat, which is a popular chat mechanism in China, was effectively a government megaphone. So people looked for another kind of architecture, and it was one that didn't rely on the internet at all. And they found it in an app called Bridgeify. Now, Bridgeify wasn't designed for revolution. It came from a San Francisco startup, and it was meant for music festivals and sports arenas where maybe Wi-Fi isn't working. It connected phones directly through Bluetooth, building a mesh network, a web of short-range links, with each phone becoming a tiny transmitter. Within 100 meters, one device can talk to the next, hopping messages across a city until they get to their destination. In Hong Kong, downloads of that Bridgeify app surged nearly 4,000% in 2 months. Protesters called it the whisper in the crowd. When police blocked major routes, people's phones would buzz. This road is clear. There's water cannons near the Admiralty. Don't go down Nathan Road. There wasn't cell tower. There weren't central servers. It was just light and proximity carrying trust. And Bridgify became the movement's digital air shaft, letting people breathe through the chokehold of surveillance. The system wasn't perfect. Computer security efforts warned that Bluetooth wasn't really private, and anyone with the right skills could monitor what devices were talking. And protesters knew that, so they limited what they said. They erased the app after they used it, but they kept using it. Because at that time, just being able to communicate was freedom. Video showed the city glowing in the dark, thousands of phones lifted like candles. Each one both a beacon and a bridge. People were forming these human chains across intersections, passing supplies hand to hand, relaying directions by app. It was like a physical and a digital mesh moving at the same time. The whole city became a kind of organism with its nervous system built on trust. And when the state threatened to cut off the internet entirely, the protesters didn't panic because they already had a blueprint. They had already built the room. They learned, like every generation before them, that resistance doesn't depend on the size of your network, but on the faith that there are others who are still listening. Every structure needs a roof, a shared surface that keeps everyone connected under one open sky. And in resistance, that roof is collective communication. That's the time when private networks and public voices overlap, not to hide, but to hold each other. So that might be journalists verifying videos before publishing them. It might be coders keeping up encryption libraries. It might be the DJs and the live streamers and the translators who make sure that the truth keeps moving across borders. And you step back and that geometry becomes visible. It's the architecture of trust. It's a structure built in every generation by people who keep choosing to speak even when silence feels safer. And the purpose of this isn't secrecy, it's continuity. Because from those radio poems to those encrypted whispers, from those protest songs to those live streams, connection is survival. So if you hear the faint static of a hidden signal, when you see a message flickering on a feed or a stranger passing verified news through a chain of hands, you're witnessing architecture in motion. The walls hold, the rooms echo, and communication, that fragile, defiant, human connection that people have together, it keeps the sky from falling. Thanks for listening, and stay sharp, everyone. Thanks for getting Unspun with me this week. Unspun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at theunspunpodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at theunspunpodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception, Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone.
Our democracy is hanging by a thread, but we know it's not about just winning and losing each battle. It's about persistence and building resilience.
That's why we're launching the Practivist Pod, the practice of activism made practical.
If you're looking for ways to get engaged or just for ways to stay sane, we want to help you navigate what comes next.
It's an exciting collaboration with political dynamo Jess Craven, author of the Chop Wood, Carry Water newsletter,
and grassroots activist Steve Pearson, host of the How We Win podcast.
Every week on the Practivist Pod, we're going to have important conversations with changemakers, give you practical ways to make an impact, have some fun, and inspire hope.
This is more than a podcast. It's a place for our community to grow our practice of advocacy for justice, equity, and progress.
Action is the best antidote for anxiety, so subscribe to the Practivist Pod today.